Anyway, no one has asked why we're here. However, I'm going to read an answer to that anyway.
Why are we here?
Why are we here?
I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens counselor, which I don't know what that is, or the Ku Klux Klaner, we know what that is, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice. He prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with you with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. And that's Martin Luther King Jr.
It's a letter from a Birmingham jail.
Okay.
So it's a great piece of writing.
Well, it's the first time I had encountered it, but anyway, let's get going. Who here? Stan, you want to read Daniel 7:14?
He was given authority, honor, and sovereignty over all the nations of the world, so that people of every race and nation and language would obey him. His rule is eternal. It will never end. His kingdom will never end.
I had to search pretty hard for something that had the idea of race in it, but this said it pretty well, I thought. Anyway, the chapter that we're looking at today, to start with anyway, is on education. The author calls it the miseducation of America. She uses the term implicit bias, which I had to look up. And implicit means questioned, unknown, or unconscious, and bias means our outlook, prejudiced, personal, and unreasoned judgment. So anyway, some of the points she makes: education maintains the status quo. Students become racists. Education maintains a racist society. Any agreement or disagreement there? How many present or past teachers do we have? I can at least see, yeah.
2 years, does that count?
Sure it does. Anyway, well, and I'm one. So that's at least 4 of us, I guess. They're past or present. Oh, really? Okay. Anyway, feel free to jump in and disagree or
Well, I think
disagree.
if we're looking at the word student as meaning a lifetime job, then we're all students from birth on. Because I think before a child ever hits school, racist tendencies may very well be there. Hopefully the schools will be in a position to change that or work with that, but to just blame the schools on it is not fair.
Okay. It's more than school, it's society,
Certainly.
but
I think parents.
this chapter focuses on school.
Okay.
Well, and she makes that point too, that students get it from their parents and get it at home. Well, just what you said before.
And they're the
Arrogance.
bigger influence. The most important people in a child's life are their parents. And schools can either reinforce what a parent is teaching or not.
Well, and speaking personally from my own past, you know, the school is right there with the parents, and I'm not sure race came up much in rural Iowa. It just wasn't hardly a factor. But
Yeah, I taught for 37 years in low-income schools in San Diego area. We had a number of Hispanics, African Americans, Arabic people. I mean, they started coming when I was getting ready to retire, but,
How many years?
37.
37. Oh, okay.
So anyway, no, it was wonderful. But I didn't really see any of that with the kids, and
Didn't see any of
I
what?
see any prejudice with the kids and at all, with, you know. I
Okay.
mean, some of the white kids had their same behavior problems as some of the other, you know, ethnicities, and it wasn't like that. And I see my granddaughter, my son's in the Coast Guard in Chesapeake, Virginia, where she's at a Christian school, but there's all cultures there. And when they were in Hawaii too, I mean, I know we're talking more about African Americans here, but her friends and everything, it just doesn't seem in the schools where I've been, hasn't seemed to be a problem at all. I had a principal though, that she was very prejudiced.
I had
Oh.
that too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And you did too.
Well, I taught in an all-black school. I was the only white person in the building. And the principal was the one that was more racist than anybody else in the building,
Yeah.
not towards me, but towards the kids.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
And the principal was black or white?
yes, she was black.
Huh,
Mine was black too.
interesting.
Yeah, she was out to get a lot of people, and then we were trying to get her, you know, there's so many complaints about her, of the way she treated the teachers. And tried to get her out, and you can't touch me type thing. It was a whole real interesting scenario that the next year she got moved though.
Well, I was in a situation like that too, where the principal got moved back into the classroom, but, and not for anything racist, but problems,
Yeah,
well, unpopular with the teachers and maybe the parents as well. I'm not
Yeah.
sure about that.
anyway, but I didn't see it with the kids. If you have the environment, excuse me, if you have the environment that everybody
Mhm.
is valued, I don't see it, but you know, when they go home, that's totally different, yeah.
I was thinking about, the idea of, think about, implicit bias or something like that, how we talk about colonialism, for instance. We think about the colonies, in America, and, then maybe we look at colonization, like the European powers, their colonies and things like that, what I recall is it was taught as kind of benign in a way that, they just kind of set out and they, established these colonies and trading in these different places, not really much attention given to the people that were already there, the indigenous people, right? And even, until more recently, as in like this last year, I still didn't really fully understand what that entailed. But then to go among talk to indigenous people and learn about colonization, it's like, it's a totally different reality.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, and that's like a subtle racism. This is not an overt, kind of thing, but the subtle way that it's kind of ingrained in us, sort of, I guess, it's kind of like the manifest destiny or something like that, anyway, that was a real eye opener for me to understand, imperialism and colonization and so on from a different, from the perspective of the people that were subjugated.
And I would say even, I'm pretty sure every state has something like this. Like we had a class you took about your state history. And in Kansas, maybe there was a footnote about there being Native Americans there before, but then it was just like how all the white settlers came and they parceled out the land, and they were these, people who were making a life for themselves out in the tough, harsh conditions of that, and talked about the Dust Bowl and all of that kind of stuff, and then they made a footnote about Nicodemus, which I don't know if y'all know about Nicodemus, but it's a very small town in western Kansas that a bunch of African Americans, after they were released from slavery, took advantage of some of the land grab stuff that they did, and they purchased this area out there, and they lived as a community out in northwest Kansas all by themselves. The question is, there's white towns nearby, so why weren't they more welcoming to just allowing them into the existing towns? But but yeah, that was, I mean, the blip on the radar was like, oh, we talked about Nicodemus, so we talked about Black people. And then the rest of it was all just, you know, Kansas history, which is a bunch of white people. Well, but then, you know, they brought in the meatpacking plants. There were a lot of like different Hispanic people that moved into the area once the meatpacking plants and that kind of stuff started. But none of that stuff was, you know, discussed at all. It was just the whitewashed piece of history.
Right.
So I think there's probably a lot of that goes on in a lot of areas that are not multicultural
Right.
in their makeup.
Well,
Well,
that's-
and in Kansas, was there anything talked about the wars with Indians and the colonists?
No, they talked about the part, they like to, you know, and again, it was good that they were on the side they were on, but they like to wave the flag of, we were on the north side during the Civil War and Missouri were the ones that come over and were, you know, we were abolitionists and they were, you know, so there was definitely, that was played up a lot. But that was pretty much it. It was just like, we're on the right side of history, so.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Right. No, this is an ongoing conversation that is being had in higher education, especially when it comes to history education. When you take a look at modern historians, they think about the way they teach United States history, they are currently rethinking that entire strategy, because it usually starts with, we settled the United States, yay, white people showed up, and that's when history got important, right? That now, when you talk with modern historians, they're taking what they call a continental perspective on United States history, where they're looking at the history of the continent going as far back as when anybody settled it, period. And sort of this the spread of human beings, and that way they can loop in the indigenous cultures and kind of look at the fact that they were here way before we were and had thousands of years of history here before we did, which I think is a really interesting shift in the conversation that they're starting to have.
But there's a ton of pushback with that.
Oh, yeah, and that's where, when you hear people get mad about, higher education is full of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI efforts, that's what it is just recognizing that white people aren't the most important people in the world. It's just kind of reframing the conversation about history and recognizing things like structural racism. And there are lots of actual legislative efforts from certain southern states, Texas, Florida in particular, that are trying to stop instructors from doing that, because they don't want the conversation to go there. They want the conversation to stay focused on this illusion that history began when white people set foot on this continent.
Okay, thank you. The author talks about how Thanksgiving was taught. And I don't remember Thanksgiving being taught. I suppose it was. But I don't know, did you teach it?
Oh, yeah. We made costumes too.
You made, okay.
Because of the
Like
Pilgrims. Yeah.
Oh, and have recess in the wigwams?
Well, I mean, it's kind of hard to have a lot of people in
I
the
know.
wigwam, but yeah.
Well,
How could we have done that?
and were the natives all pleasant and teaching the white people how to grow corn and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah.
You gotta put a fish in the hole first, and then, you have to put a little fish in the hole first and then plant your corn.
Yeah, that's right.
No. Wayne, my hearing aids went out this morning in mid-song, and so if I'm having trouble hearing you, the owl is too, probably. Anyway,
Can I, so when we were taught history that way, I'm assuming you didn't think there was anything wrong with that. I mean, that was history. Or were you so enlightened at that point in time,
No.
so wait, what's going on here?
Oh, no.
This isn't the truth. Yeah, so what's behind that? And none of us caught it, but all of a sudden, when exposed to this different perspective, everybody in this room suddenly realizes, you know, I guess that means we're now becoming woke, right? But what was it that kind of kept us from seeing the implications of our own history on the people that were here? I mean, what is the narrative so strong?
Well,
Or
yeah, I mean, we think about,
was it insidious though?
well, think about the television that you grew up with and the radio shows that you, you know,
Good,
that you
blame
grew up
that.
with, right?
Right.
Well, but look at the depiction of black people, you know,
Yeah.
people of color
Oh, yeah.
in those. Those all help feed into
Yeah.
these stereotypes and these narratives that are quietly ingrained in us.
Yeah.
and so we just kind of go about our lives and we don't really pay much attention, to that. I'm just thinking of another sort of, an epiphany, I guess. Well, I saw on somebody's Facebook, Schrodinger's cat, right? I don't know, something that has to do with quantum,
It does.
and like the cat's either alive or it's dead and you won't know until you open the box or something
Right.
like that. And anyway, so somebody had,
It's a physics.
it's a physics
thing,
thing, yeah. Somebody had put like a thing that said Schrodinger's immigrant. And it said, on the one hand, the lazy immigrant that's taken all the social resources, and the other one that's taken all our jobs, right? So which is it? And we're given kind of these, narratives and things like that just subtly feed in, and they've been reinforced. I think things are changing, some over time, but I think about a lot of the cartoons and things that I watch and so on, that's like, how could that apply? But we laughed at all those things.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's a lot that, we have to kind of unpack. I was just, an epiphany that I had, like, if you buy something like at Home Depot and, the instructions are like, in English and in Spanish, sometimes in French also. And, I didn't really think about it a whole lot until I was with a friend of mine who was a builder at the time. And he was meeting with a guy who was gonna do, drywall, and he was, Spanish was his first language. I don't know where he's from exactly. But then it kind of dawned on me, a lot of people, it's like, wow, that's so that the tradesmen that might, come from a Spanish speaking country, can, and there are a lot of these people that are doing, this work that kind of, but anyway, but they're hidden, I think, largely from us. And so we don't have reference points until we are immersed in it. So like the experience of Alaska in that same way, that I don't really have a reference point so much for the indigenous experience, Native Alaskan experience in particular. And then when you see it through their eyes, you're like, oh my gosh. But there's not much that invites us to do that. In fact, there's a lot that wants, these hidden subtle forces, because they challenge our thinking, and so wouldn't we rather just set those aside? Anyway.
Yeah, humor covers a lot of stuff, doesn't it, really? I mean, I grew up on Amos and Andy, and in the 6th grade, there was a fellow in our class named Joe Black, and we put our arms around each other and walk around the playground and say, we're the Colored Brothers. Joe Black and Wayne Brown. We thought it was hilarious. Yeah.
But I think, I don't know, other people here from different areas, like when I grew up, I think there were 3 people of color in my whole high school, right? And they had gotten used to living and working around white people because that's the place they grew up. And so, and even when I went to college, it was better, but it was still heavily white. And Paul, having gone to high school in a more 50-50 environment, just learning from his experience was eye-opening for me. And then just with social media allowing more voices to be heard, I think. And then I started kind of going down a road and there's a community online about people who are kind of over a lot of the things that the church was and are trying to find a way forward with their faith journey while still not having to kind of look away from a lot of the injustice issues and things that are out there. And like, how do we find a place in our faith world with the knowledge of all these other things that we've now come to? And there's just a lot of people of color, people with different sexual identities that are preaching and speaking within those circles. And so I've heard words being spoken and things being shared that I just had never heard before. But you do, like Matt said, you have to kind of say, I'm going to set aside what I used to think and what I used to be, because this is going to challenge me, right? And it takes a conscious effort to do that. And to be honest, if the old way works for you, why would you?
Right.
I mean, I have a family member that we have this conversation about, and my sister is like, I just don't understand why they don't look at the plight of some of these people and are really frustrated with it. I was like, because it works for them. And if the system works for them, why would they're not aware of any problems, right? So why would they look for them? So being open to seeing these things, and it is, and you do, you feel kind of embarrassed, like I look back at some of the ways I reacted to
Oh my
things,
gosh.
and you just go, gosh, like, that was terrible, what was I thinking?
But at the time, it was accepted.
And again, but that's the problem, right? And
No, I know,
I
I'm
think
just
that's what Dawn's
Yeah.
getting at here, is that it was such a underpinning that we didn't even notice we were part of it, right?
Well, I kind of noticed when I taught in suburban Kansas City, I was a judge at the science fair.
Mhm.
And the inner city kids, I could tell from their projects, were like 2 years behind my suburban kids. And I don't know why or how that came to be,
Mhm.
but that's the way it was. And then at the college level, I went to the University of Missouri in Kansas City, right in the center of town. And lots of Black people lived there, but in college, they were very underrepresented. And I don't recall a single student in either a science or a math class, single student of color anymore. It's just all white, which it's weird, and I have no explanation for that, but that's the way it was. I think things are getting better in those respects, but
Think about even girls, they weren't represented either, so,
well, except in nursing classes.
yeah. Well, I mean, but yeah, for
Yeah.
math and science and stuff, I
When
mean,
I was in graduate school, I taught laboratories for student nurses and all women as far as I
yeah, so,
recall.
yeah.
Well, do you remember the movie about the first moon landing and the women?
Hidden Figures,
Hidden figures,
Yeah.
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
the calculators at NASA.
Right.
Yeah.
Were hidden and discriminated against to some extent. Okay, where did we get to here?
Line 1.
Not far.
Well, coming down here to the story of Mrs. Hooper, really brought back memories for me, an unpleasant one, about the one Black student that I had when I was teaching in suburban Kansas City. Anyway, his observations, however, during his observations, McCadden noticed that Black children, especially boys, were often more harshly disciplined than white boys of similar behavior. Yet McFadden does not claim that Mrs. Hooper is a racist. In fact, Mrs. Hooper was a champion for racial equality in the school, regularly challenging the school board to be more inclusive in its curriculum and in its racial leadership. Still, despite her anti-racist actions and her deep desire to serve all of her students, Mrs. Hooper was a tool for the white empire. So anyway, that brought back memories of me and my one Black student in an otherwise all-white school. One day when Les was absent, outspoken girl raises her hand and says, "Do you realize you're harsher on Les than you are the rest of us when we do the same things?" And I went, "No." And all the other kids went, "Yeah."
Wow.
And so that was kind of a shock. And I went and talked to the principal about it, and I forget what he said, but I hopefully did better after that realization. But anyway, the story of Mrs. Hooper here really.
So the question is, why does that happen?
Mhm.
Why does Mrs. Hooper, let's just stick there, not you. Why was she more harsh on Black students, Black male, than white? Why?
Probably out of fear.
Well,
Well, or something
some of
great.
it was that they said that they spoke a different language that she did not understand. For instance, if you say to a child, "Is that where the scissors belong?" Implying, no, that's not where the scissors belong, go put them back where they do belong. And so a white child would understand what you're really asking, because her parents asked that kind of stuff and things like that. And they'd say, no, and then they'd go put it back where it belongs. But a black child, in this story, they weren't taught that, so they answered appropriately, no. Is that where the scissors belong? No. And then she took it as they were being insolent. Well, then go put it back. But she didn't say that. She just said, is that where they belong? And they go, no, that's not where they belong. And then they just sat there. So she took it as they were being, not compliant, where the white kid was, because the white kid didn't want to put it back where they did belong. But the black kid just thought, I'm answering your question. And so they were kind of indicating that sometimes, so she treated that person harsher because she thought that they were giving her back, pushing back on her when they weren't. And she didn't realize that just the way we speak to kids, we assume they understand what we're talking about because this is how we've been raised. They maybe have been raised different way of speaking and things like that, and so I think that was, because they pointed that out to her, it's like, oh, yeah, that child wasn't being, sarcastic to me. They were just answering my question. No, that's not where they belong. I've answered your question.
So it's more than just the answer. It's also how we respond and how we're taught to respond. And so, yeah, I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah, so
It's just,
we have to realize the language in everything that we speak. We are speaking, this is how I've been taught, this is how white people think, da 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 da. This is not necessarily how other cultures think. And it doesn't mean that they're being,
Connolly calls that coded language.
Yeah.
And, yeah, and, we don't think about it, but it's there, and that can create a difference of separation between the white teacher and the black person, student of color, let's call it, rather than just black. But anyway, especially if it's Hispanic kids that English is their second language, why it's going to be even more difficult there, probably. Sure.
Is there also, when you talk about things that have been internalized and you don't even realize they're there, as a culture, we've been taught to be extra aware or even possibly fearful around men of color, going back to after slavery when there was a lot of men being jailed for things that had nothing to do with anything other than basically pre-Jim Crow, right? And then it became Jim Crow. So you've got this culture for 100 years of Black men, you could maybe lump some Hispanic men into that as well, have a higher rate of being in prison and breaking the law and all these things. And we have always viewed in the United States, I think, education as a way to get people on a different path. It is a way to make a life that can be different from what your parents and your grandparents went through. And so is that teacher trying in a meaningful way to help that child not end up in that situation, and her being harsh on him is her way of trying to get him to not end up going in this way that our minds think that person will end up, even though it's technically racial bias that makes us think that way, right? That child is not necessarily going to end up any more likely to commit a crime than the white boy next to him, necessarily. And there's probably other socioeconomic issues, but is that maybe a reason why? Do we try to create structure and, I don't know, some sort of can we save that child, right? But then that goes back to why does the child need to be saved? They just need to be loved and cared for and educated. But is there a piece of that?
Well, and to me, I keep thinking about teacher education. And in my own, I don't think any of this was covered at all. And it probably should have been. And maybe today, hopefully it is. But, the early 1970s were a long time ago. So things have changed, and hopefully for the
I'm
better.
not so sure that it's,
You can see Brenda's response to Sarah was saying this, by the way.
uh-oh.
Oh, this
It'll come back, it'll come back. It's okay. It's
So
okay.
that's
It's just,
what we would hope.
oh, no.
That's what we would hope, Sarah.
What was your comment?
Oh, just Brenda made a comment to what Sarah was just talking about there.
Which was?
She said that's what we would hope, Sarah.
That
I
people
saw
would just
it
be
before,
loved, yeah.
And again, I'm not saying that the mindset isn't good, like that's what they're saying here, right? Is
Mhm.
they want every child to succeed, but sometimes we need to think about our way of implementing how we think we're helping. Are we actually
Right.
helping?
Sure.
Well, part of that is being aware of our racist
Right.
views and being able to adjust how we are going to approach others when put in that position.
Nancy, you had something?
No, I was thinking, I'm not so sure that I think the teachers, the educators, parents, we have to judge to the level where the kids are in their language and understanding, not expect them for us to just burst forth with our regular way of speaking. It sounds bizarre, but that assume that they're a child. I don't care if they're 4 or they're 15. Assume that they're a child and we teach them in a way that, I don't know how to explain this.
In the way that they understand.
It's our job to teach so that they understand.
Mhm.
Yeah, sort of.
Well, kind of like where you have done all this testing of a child and they fall into certain levels of their reading abilities, their math abilities, and even though they may be in first grade, they may have a 12th grade understanding of math
Yeah, that's
and
not,
that sort of thing. Because then you can take this first grader and talk to them about algebra and geometry. But the vice versa is true too.
but what I was more thinking was, talking about disciplining a Black child, that our intention may be one thing, but the child doesn't understand that intention.
Right.
We have to adjust to, common plain language and to tell a child, I'm disciplining you for your own good, whether it's a white kid or a Chinese child or a Black. What does that mean to that kid? Absolutely nothing. Well, what's my own good? So we often use language, just even as parents, that is way beyond. We have to lower our heads a little bit, and to say that we're going to discipline to make the child better, especially with a Black child or whatever nationality, that doesn't seem right to me at all. We take the child where he is, not where we hope he's going to be.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, you walk through a Black neighborhood and you listen to the language that's going on. It's gonna seem foreign to you. You'll recognize
It
parts of it,
does, it does.
but the way they use the language is totally different. And so when it comes to instructing
Mhm.
another, I've had Black instructors too. And I sometimes have to think twice about what they've said.
Well, I had a Japanese daughter-in-law that told me that the hardest, she spoke several different languages, and she said the hardest language to understand is English, because there's all these innuendos and all these quirky little things that people do that you're supposed to discount what I just said, aren't ya? And she said, she just couldn't figure out what it is, and jokes. Anything that is sarcastic or a joke, she said, just forget it. Please don't even trouble me with that kind of stuff because I don't get it.
Well,
So,
And then there's American English, there's English, there's Canadian English, there's Australian English.
I think-
They all have all these little things.
So I think part of the, it's not just a matter of communicating, it is understanding how whiteness, this sort of undefined thing shapes our lives
exactly.
and the way that we move about in the world. I just happened to wake up, some of you know Mark Charles from his book Unsettling Truths, and on Facebook it popped up because I unfriended him or whatever on Facebook, he was doing like a live conversation with the guy from Seattle, actually, who does a lot of anti-racism stuff. And they were talking about how I think his name is maybe Scott Hall or something. You could probably Google him. He does like podcasting and things like that. But he's a white guy who took a Black Studies class, African American Studies class, and has done a lot of kind of anti-racism work. And they were talking about how, like, whiteness sort of defines itself against as what it's not in other, as opposed to an actual, like, an identity. And that's why it's hard for us to understand what sort of whiteness is, or what your culture is. And so I think that's a lot of what, so is this woman a racist, this teacher? Not intentionally. Right? But she's feeding into the same, so yes, by definition, you know what I mean? And in that same way, we might think about ways and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I used to think that, or I said that, or whatever, because I'm not aware of my own bias and how that might, sort of shade my interactions with other, people of color in the world.
I can give you a really simple example. This all-Black school that I was talking about, one of the rules for me, not for the other teachers, but for me, was that I was not allowed to touch one of the kids because the Blacks would take it differently. I may be, put my arm around a kid and say, nice job, but that isn't how a Black child might have taken it. So I had special rules because I was white. And one of them was do not touch the children. That was very, very difficult.
Well, but that's the way things were getting when I was teaching too, in the 70s and early 80s. Just don't dare touch me for anything.
Like, that's not even a thought that enters my head now in my classroom. Like, no, like, why would I ever touch a kid? Right? Why would I ever be anywhere close to a student and like put my hand on them?
Well, you're also teaching.
I'm also teaching
not
adults.
4-year-olds.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but I mean, it's just, that thought is so alien to me.
Well, she makes the point in the next chapter, like what Jim was talking about, that their language is so different. When we hear it, we tend to think, oh, they're uneducated, oh, they're not as smart as the rest of us, and that's not really true. It's just different. And what else was I going to say along that line?
Well, one of the other associations is, oh, this is how they learn to talk in prison.
Okay.
Because it's different to us, and that's one of the places we hear it, is in prisons. Well, why do we hear it there? Well, because we put so many of them in there. But
it's also true for Hispanics that are speaking Spanish instead of English, or any immigrant speaking any form of language.
I think to Matt's point, though, what's interesting is, and we all do it, and I catch myself doing it all the time, we keep centering the conversation on us and whiteness, right? Those other things are different from us, like we're some kind of gold standard, when really whiteness, the way Black people speak, the way Hispanic people speak, the way Japanese Americans speak, the way whatever, like we're all just different from each other. There isn't a, like, this is the thing to compare everything else to, but it's even in the way that we speak, we center ourselves in the conversation. And I think that's what I've really spent a lot of time this year just catching myself doing, is because I'm trying to relate to something. I think that's a human nature, is like, I want to be able to relate to this thing we're talking about. So I'm going to pull something from my experience to do that. But sometimes I just need to step out. Like, this is not, the conversation isn't about me. It's more for me to just observe and learn from, right? And it took a long time for me to figure that out, because I kept trying to insert myself, and then I'm like, dude, you're trying to make yourself the center of attention, and that's not what this is. So I think it's just evidence to us, I think, how ingrained it is. We don't even realize that we do it.
And I think because we're so aware of how we come across to people, that we work too hard at it. We forget to be real. We forget to be the person that we really are. And we're so concerned that we're going to upset them, or whatever, that we're too careful with our language with them. We just have to be real people. And
We can end up doing that with our own families.
yeah,
Well, that's actually, I think, part of white culture. So like Matt kind of pointed out, one facet of it is it defines itself by what it isn't. I mean, white culture is extremely hypercritical,
yeah,
really hypercritical. We want to present ourselves as good people. That's another important part of our culture.
Yeah,
And we try to make
exactly.
everybody like us. And that results in us behaving like that.
Mhm.
What I read from the book is that if they, people from other cultures have their own kind of language, and then when they step into a very structured white, they switch it to conform to the white language, so they can, and it's exhausting for them to have to constantly be thinking, okay, how do I say that in white language? And I get that in some respect because I'm medical. So I'm most comfortable when I'm talking to doctors and nurses about medical conditions, about what an aortic aneurysm is, and all these different things. And I'm most comfortable talking about that. And then I have to explain this complicated medical, procedure to a person who doesn't understand any of that. And I have to go, okay. Then I have to try to backtrack, and it's exhausting in some ways to sit there and try to think of how to say it plainly so that they understand. And I'm much more comfortable to sit there and talk all day long to a medical professional than try to explain that same thing it's exhausting. And so I can imagine how exhausting it would be to a person that's got, a different perspective. Just last night was pretty funny. One of the Chaffee clients was asking for a spreader. What he meant was like something to spread butter with, a little plastic knife. I immediately went to a spreader. You open up an open heart chest, and I was thinking, what the heck does he want a spreader? And I looked at him like, what? And he goes, a spreader. And I'm thinking, what? And then he goes, for butter. And I went, oh, but we were talking two different languages, I was just thinking of spreader to open the chest with, and he was thinking of spreader to spread with.
And see, I'm thinking
I'm thinking
of
of
a lawn.
spreader.
But again, that's how experience informs context, and context informs word choice and semantics. There's a whole psychology of this.
Yeah.
That like you carry your toolkit, your mental toolkit with you everywhere you go, and it's built off of your experiences, your privilege, the places that you move through. Right. So I mean, this simple association is influenced by all of that, and we don't think sometimes about how when we sit down with our toolbox and we're talking with someone with a completely different toolkit, like it results in significant misunderstandings like that.
Gran Torino.
Oh, the Clint Eastwood movie?
There's a,
Yeah, Vicky Rockwell saying the main thing is people want to feel care and connection and respect.
and I think there's no way to avoid being uncomfortable with communication when you're dealing with a bunch of different people with different modes of communication. There's no way that it's not, but I think all of us need to have a little grace for other people trying, just like we would hope that other people would give us grace for trying, right? And so there's little hiccups along the way, and if you know the person and you communicate with them and you can figure out what ways they appreciate being communicated with or what things they don't appreciate. I know in a more global context, you can't really do that if you're just walking by someone on the bus or whatever. But if you know people, you can really have discussions with them about how, like, some of those deeper kind of interaction things. But I think none of us are all gonna get it right all the time. And I'm not saying that to excuse that we should all be total jerks, but like, again, I think everybody is mindful, and like Pam was saying, everybody does the work, right? And so if you understand that there's some work involved with communicating with people who communicate different than you, then, just give people a little grace, like.
I'd like to point out something here, though. Your work has included chapter 6, where we identifying ourselves for some of the racial kinds of comments we might make. And it's an interesting chapter, I think,
Oh, yeah.
as we look at
Don,
what does it mean.
To pose a quick, are you here next Sunday?
Yeah.
So my material doesn't technically, I can stretch it to 2, but it doesn't have to. Would it, to give us enough time to really talk about chapter 6, would you like to start next week? And then I can just pick up from whenever,
Okay,
and then
And then we can get into chapter 6.
and we can just, as far as I'm concerned, Pam, we can just push this as far as we wanted to an extra week if need be to cover it. If we
Because
want.
I agree, I wanna, I
Yeah,
think that's
there's some
important
good
stuff
stuff
as well, but I don't wanna like cram it into like, here's 5 minutes to
Oh,
have
no.
a really meaningful conversation.
I agree.
Because I think, yes, we do need to have a talk about justifying ourselves.
Mhm.
I think you could continue on for maybe another 5 minutes or so. I have to go kind of get ready and everything, but yeah.
Is there something that tells us what to read every week on this class?
We're not,
Oh, so you're.
we're not actually,
Following the
yeah,
book,
we're
but
following the
not
book. You're not,
So what should we read for next week?
nothing, just come. But if you wanted to read what chapter, yeah.
Be 6.
Well, 6
Yeah.
6 and 7, do 6 and 7.
You have 4 chapters to read, and I'm gonna write an exam for you.
Yeah, there will be a quiz next week.
It's happened.
I could tell.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on it. I'll take over the Zoom stuff here, so I got you covered.
Yeah, well, you may have been seeing it up there, my back's to it, so
No, you're good.
I don't know what,
I've got it.
it sounds like we've got at least 3 people out there
Yes.
in Etherland, and we don't know what they're saying in the chat function is on. Anyway, we are out of time.
Yeah.
I wrote down a proverb here to close with. Joyful is the person who finds wisdom, the one who gains understanding. So that's kind of why we're here. And that's kind of a sell for all of these classes and continuing education.
And I want to say thank you to all of you guys for, I think what's really cool about this is we've created a really safe space to have these conversations. Because I've been in worlds where people have either justifiably so known these things a lot longer than I have, and and there can be a lot of probably rightly so, but judgment on people coming along behind, right? But also people who are very anti and not open to it and immediately going into justifying why this isn't a thing. And I just appreciate people's honesty and supportiveness, and I think it's good to be in a good group of people.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay.
Brenda just thanked us. And I thank Brenda, because why not? Let's be grateful.
Well, and her focus on this is a little different than the rest of us by virtue of being both, having been a teacher and being indigenous. So, I don't know, she's also pretty quiet, so probably not kind of share a whole lot.
That's okay.
Anyway, thank you for all of your input, and pretty much everyone's had something to say about something, and I appreciate that. So, thank you.
Should we close in prayer?
Okay, maybe very quickly.
Go for it.
Oh, great.
You volunteered.
I volunteer. Oh, of course. God, thank you that while these issues are hard, we have the opportunity to talk about them with each other. Please help us to continue to set aside our defenses at the door when we discuss this stuff, and to come prepared to listen and to learn and to try our hardest to understand despite our limitations. Thank you for your grace, because we really, really, really need it as we explore this stuff. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah, watch Gran Torino. Is Clint Eastwood's character, that's the question. Honestly, you should watch that.